everybody in my family has told me, don't do it the way that I'm about to do it, but I tried doing it all correctly and doing it, reading it out, but I think it would be terribly stulted. So you've got me more or less ad-libbing from little cues that I've got here. I'm the IYN Director, Treasurer, which I've done for about 12 years now, and it's good fun. I think I did it partly because I really agree with the whole precepts of the IYN and how they work. I'll come back to that. Okay, I'm a builder by trade and do jobbing buildings for people, and I've done that for all my life, as well as practice yoga all my life. There's never been a time I can ever remember when I wasn't into yoga. Even, I would say, well above 50 years, I tried at the beginning, when I started to understand yoga, about 30 years ago, I tried to make a living with that. And I found personally it was impossible. And I think what happened to me was, one day I was doing a class and I had about 45 in the one class and I had 15 in the next, and there were one back after another. And I suddenly realised that what I was doing was I was getting the numbers in and I was feeding them. And I realised I wasn't being as truthful to my original way of yoga as I should be. And I rolled back from that and I stopped. And at that point, I lost a lot of numbers, but I became far more genuine in my teaching and far more honest in it. And so I started working more then. Stuck up the old building and started telling all my contacts, yes, I'll do that for you. And started clambering round on roofs, etc., which is what I do and enjoy doing. And carried on with that. Anyway. I think we all have our own solution to this little problem of money, and it's up to you to do it. But I do think it's essential you keep your integrity there. I think we've all got to be careful. It isn't just a way of earning dosh. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, that finishes that. Now we go into the yoga. Now, you can't really talk about what yoga is on its own. You've got yoga itself and you've got the meanings and the means to yoga. And these are totally separate. Yoga is an actual state. All the rest are how you go about it. And you have to put them separate. Otherwise you're in trouble. And as far as I'm concerned, the big part is the second part. That's the part you can talk about. You can't really talk about the first, except it's not this, it's not that, it's not that. I'm still going to do it, though. To me, yoga is taking life exactly as it unfolds, all the while. Now, I take it from a sort of psychological perspective, which is that you've got a thought, and at that very beginning of thought, there's an argument occurs. And we're never quite ourselves, ever. And it's there that yoga operates, which is why you have to become very quiet to get to that point. Yeah? You can't just approach this directly. It has to be approached in all sorts of oblique methods. And I think it's one of these things that approaches over time. You have it, I think everybody has it a little bit when they relax deeply. When you get really deeply relaxed, you start realising, oh, I'm scared of that way of being, that way of doing things. And then you're approaching yoga. Yeah? But once, a really good point here, which I think should be added, when you get very quiet, I think we all come across something very special as well, which is when there is nothing, there is joy. I mean, not just like, oh, I feel happy. There's literally a well of happiness, of joy, of ananda. And if you enter that, you never come out of it quite the same. And that has to be always emphasised. And it doesn't mean you have to be enlightened for this or anything. It means you've experienced it. And if anybody gets a little bit quieter, they become that way. Now, I'm not a person who vastly believes that we should all become calmer, quieter, gentler in our lives, because I feel you're covering the chaos which is still there with a sort of falseness on top. You're like putting it a layer on it. It's like trying to cover a volcano that's going to go off anyway, you know. And I think you're in danger zones. And I think there's quite a lot of yoga people who are trying to be very relaxed, very cool. And if you tread on the toes a little bit, or you say something they don't like, boof, they're out and you're in trouble. And I think you have to be aware that that is there. And that can only leave or go in one way, and that's by embracing your original self and totally acknowledging it. Your frailties, your smallness, your big-headedness, everything, and realise they're all playing, they're all, you know, it's only a pretense. Anyway, Vritti Chitti Niroda, I remember I put that at the bottom of the page just because when this was put in a Facebook page, somebody put this in a reply to me, this is what yoga means, you know. What's it mean? The cessation of the movements within the mind. And I quite like it, really, but I'm no massive fan of, going to books to learn your yoga. I think you get your yoga incrementally through your silence and through your challenges. Anyway, we're going to the means to yoga now. There's loads of sorts of yoga. When I started with understanding yoga about 30 odd years ago, I started going to classes. I did it very much the opposite way to most people. I practiced yoga nearly totally alone for decades, and then I understood yoga, and then I didn't know what the heck to do about it. And then I decided, I went off and I got myself a little bit better educated. And then I thought, well, the answer to this is I'll do some counselling, because I realised what it had done for me. There was a before and an after. And I started going up and counselling people, chatting to them. And I realised it was such a tedious process and so slow. And it never seemed to be helping. It does help people. I'm an enormous fan of it. But I felt it wasn't moving rapidly enough. So I thought yoga was better than that. And I thought, damn it, I've given it in. And I thought, nah, it does work. It worked with you. Get going. And so I just started to muck in. I went off, I did a yoga training course, and almost instantly found myself teaching. I had a few bits now that aren't here. When I first started teaching, I had not a clue how people ordinarily were. I mean by ordinarily, I do building, and so I thought people would be able to lift weights and do things and do this, that, and I suddenly realised people are actually quite not very strong. And so the first few classes I had, nobody ever returned because they were all felt dead at the end. So I thought, and I remember sitting down very quietly thinking, well, who can I teach? And in my science, I suddenly realised the path I'd taken and building all that, and I ended up working in prisons, and that's where I spent literally years teaching, and I loved it. They were just my blokes. They were just, it was great fun. I think I teach ordinary classes now far more, and I find that easier than the other way. But the me of 30 years ago much preferred that. Anyway, in some ways, I think it's absolutely impossible to teach yoga because we all have such an amazingly different lives, all of us. I mean, I know mine is, but I mean, if I chat to any of you, you'll all tell me it's such a different story that, and we all tend to think that, oh, I'm just like, and no, you're not. You're ever so different. And I think there has to be keep coming across, and you have to almost encourage people to see you're different, and it's okay, and that unpleasantness is okay. Yeah. I know quite a few people who've told me that, for example, that it's really helpful to learn Sanskrit is one. And to be perfectly honest, I see nothing wrong with it. But I see learning Sanskrit, I see learning how your body works more. All these philosophies, as far as I'm concerned, they're putting off techniques. I think you've just got to get in there and you've got to learn to be quiet yourself and become more and more silent inside you. Not silent in the extent of being a meek and quiet person, but silent in the extent that you can be so quiet inside you can get to your own very central being. Silence. And from that, you will move on and you will come out a different person. Not a different person, the same one, the genuine one, the one you'd prefer to be in nearly all cases. Okay. In fact, I think I'm saying the same as I said at the other one. I think the only essential is knowing your own mess and embracing it. And being gentle with yourself. I think that's essential as well, because I think when you start to realise what you like, I think there's a certain amount of violence can start arriving. And I think that's something really to be cautious with. Okay. And I think you have to do a lot of this work alone. And to do this alone, I think you need more encouragement from other people than anything to tell you, yes, you can, you're okay. That you is okay, to be you. And I think all the learning, the deep learning, the Sanskrit, the everything else, I think we underestimate ourselves. I think we learn all these things vastly quicker than we think. I think the amount of knowledge we can absorb, can take in, it goes right through the roof. I think we have amazing brains, and we're all covering them over because we think we ought to. I've got to learn this, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. And I think that it's such a negative influence. And the second you calm down, you sit down, you start applying that good, sharp brain that we've all got, I think exponentially we shoot it, loads can go by. Right, we come to attachment in a way. Now, I think we have to look at attachments to things rationally, because we all think we've got to give things up. I'll be such a good person, I'll give everything away to others, etc. But I think that's a total misunderstanding of what things are. You own nothing anyway. And when you start to understand that you can't own things, you breathe the air, it goes in, it goes out, the body you've got's continuously changing, it's aging, it's going off. That's okay. The buildings you've got are all, that you live in, they're going downhill as well. Everything's going down. If you own more, you've only got more work to do. And it's a matter of understanding this. Oh, I've only got minutes left. Okay. And I actually think that attachments to nationality, religions, anything is a negative, because they are part of your attachments. You don't own them. And you're drawing a line around yourself, which doesn't exist. And I think it's a big issue, is to get rid of that idea within you. Not unnaturally. I mean, I love, for example, the area I come from in the Midlands. I do like it, but I don't actually think it means anything very deep. Let's go. I've got a few pages to go. Now, I have no qualms at all about yoga being taught by loads of different people in small quantities, right, left and centre. 200-hour peoples, etc., I think are great. As long as I think there are enough people who have deep knowledge around to question them and move them and challenge them, I think that's good enough. I think that's the way it works. I mean, I'm never going to compete with a handsome 25-year-old something who's teaching, having a wonderful following. It doesn't matter. I mean, as long as you are totally genuine, people will learn still from you, and you will still grow. It's a matter just of developing yourself. And I think getting to the base of yoga is about resetting your brain. Because I always like to take things from that mental, psychological perspective. Last bit. No, it isn't. That's it. That's it. That's it. Anyway, there you are.
My talk is, as Debbie said, it could raise some eyebrows. It's going to be, I'm going to be bringing up some interesting concepts. I call myself a yoga therapist. I've stopped calling myself a yoga teacher. And I'll be talking a little bit as to why I've chosen to do that. I also see myself as a facilitator of yoga. And I'm also a psychotherapeutic counsellor. And the two for me go very well together. Very similar to what Jim was saying about, you know, the supporting people. I see my role as really helping and supporting people. So my talk is called Freedom to Breathe. And it's using yoga as a therapeutic and healing practice. So I'm going to be talking from my experience. It's my story, but then when I was chatting to Debbie, I realized it's not just about me. What I'm actually going to be saying here is a lot of people from my background are feeling very much like this. So it's even though it's my particular story, I think many people hold this idea of yoga. So I'm not going to be making any claims to universality. I'm going to be authentic, specific to this time and space, and I'm really interested in shifting the ways of thinking about and using yoga from the norm. I'm going to be centering indigenous, decolonial and feminist experiences and experiences from the South Asian community. And I'm going to be very honest about where I'm coming from. And that's a little picture from a workshop that I did. So that kind of gives you I think the pictures, I hope that the pictures can speak for themselves. So far I've been faced with this, and we all see this. We see yoga used in cultural appropriation, commodification, and we also see on the other side ethno-nationalism, caste hierarchy. So this for me is the face of yoga. This is what we all see, right? And this, I'm going to stay here for a little longer just so this picture can go in. So I think when I started to address these questions, it was not easy for me I don't think it's easy for any of us to actually look at this and talk about this. It's actually really horrible and difficult. And actually, I feel like it's quite messy to actually even begin to try to articulate or even sort of draw your attention to what is going on. But it's troubling. It can be quite troubling. So what I'm thinking about is that our yoga spaces are not neutral. They're not little bubbles away from the everyday world. Okay. So the question that I have is, what are we actually doing with our yoga? And well, I might come back to this, and I'll just pop to this. Okay, here. No, I'll go back to this. I'm losing my courage. Now I'm going to come back to it. Okay, so I have a particular question about the way that we teach yoga. Some of my thoughts have been around, are we enabling people to just readjust? So, and how can that be, you might ask? How can that be? Surely yoga, if we're teaching yoga, we're doing something good and we're actually supporting people. One of the things that I've heard about today with the talks is that yoga is it's about self-inquiry, it's about self-knowledge, it's a spiritual practice, it's a very profound practice. So if you're actually teaching something that's so profound and so powerful, how do you actually do that with people that are coming from very difficult backgrounds or vulnerable places, or they might have come from socio-economic marginalized communities, cultural communities? So it's about really thinking about how to apply your yoga teaching in a way that addresses power and privilege dynamics. And if this is all new to you, then come and chat with me later. I sometimes think that our emphasis on big asana movements is about catharsism, that we're just kind of purging, that when we do these very strong asana practices in heated environments, are we just getting addicted to the intensity and purging? Right? So what goes on in some of the yoga studios around me is that they can be very sort of very strong, intense physical practices, quite quick. There's not much time for feedback. Okay. So this is why I'm quite interested in, is our yoga teaching neutral? Do we just stand there and teach? This has taken me some years of thinking it through, but I used to think that I was just a neutral, just somebody who just taught yoga, but I realized I wasn't. And that the way that we actually pass on information is not done in a very sterile way, that we're not just here and passing on the information. It's not so straightforward as that. So I'm particularly interested in the how and the why of what we do, and what makes you choose what you do and how you teach. I think that we rely on outdated pedagogies. I think that it would be useful to look at the pedagogies a little bit more that we're using, that maybe we're not even considering our background, so our epistemic inheritance, how we have been taught, and then the way that we then teach others. So, for example, I know that in the UK right now, I would be looking at everything through a particular lens. So I'd be using a white Christian scientific materialism, prioritization of rational problem-solving states, questions and answers. Okay, so quite didactic methods. Okay. I'm particularly interested in a relational basis for teaching yoga and a subjective basis for teaching yoga. So that's just teaching from exactly where you're at, who you are, and being very clear about that, and all your biases and all your assumptions and all your conditioning. So I don't know if this is actually part of any teacher training curriculums, because it'd be interesting to know if it is. But I actually trained as a psychotherapist after hitting a crisis point as a yoga teacher, because I was doing one-to-ones with people, and they were coming to me with I just felt like I was out of my depth and I couldn't understand certain things. People were coming in vulnerable states. And when I did my training as a psychotherapist, I actually felt like I became a lot happier in my yoga teaching, a lot more grounded. I actually felt I felt like a lot more at home because of this concept of reflexivity, which is self-knowledge. And it's about turning back and reflecting on yourself, but it's not just reflecting on your internal self, but it's reflecting on yourself in your world. Who are you in your world? What kind of biases do you have? What kind of assumptions do you have? What made you who you are? And this is, I think Debbie said this in her intro video, it's not about self-flagellation. So self-knowledge isn't about self-flagellation. It can be. It can get really heavy and intense. It's a labor of love. I like to see it as a labor of love. It concerns relationship, polishing the mirror of the heart, and it supports you to prevent taking space for other people. So when you're a teacher, you can take up a lot of space. You can talk to people, you can tell people what to do, how to move, what techniques will help them. But are you really speaking for them? So this reflexivity brings back more of the dialogue. And I think it's certainly slowed me down. So I do a lot less, and I say a lot less. I'm probably saying way more than I normally do just by standing here. I really don't talk this much normally. And it supports somatic empathy, which attunement, involvement. So these are tools to facilitate or teach yoga, although I don't use the word teach. A little bit more about that. This is something that I quite like. It's about riding the donkey backwards. So paying attention to yourself, more so than actually paying attention to other people in the room. Observing your own observations, what is your reaction in the moment. So it's a constant state of self-reflection when you're teaching or being with other people. And so this is about the concept, it goes back to a decolonial concept of power with others rather than power over. I really do think that it could be helpful to examine how much of our pedagogies, the ones that we've inherited from our Victorian era, militarism, is punishment, the schools, is based on speaking over people or telling people kind of what to do. Just put it in that way. So this is the power with understanding. The power with comes through observing yourself, and as Mullah Nasruddin rides the donkey backwards, he's not interested in his destination, he's interested in himself. So, addressing the elephant in the room. This is an elephant in a yoga studio, so I managed to get a picture. I'd like to talk about this, so these are some of the questions that maybe not being talked about. And this helps us to understand what is yoga, because all sorts of unacknowledged dynamics are happening in class or one-to-one, okay? Basically, we are interacting with people's hearts and minds. That's pretty profound. Their thoughts, their feelings, their experiences. So yoga is a really powerful tool. And everyone will know this, everyone's come across this. Movement and breath creates shifts in the body that evoke memory and emotion. So you'll be teaching and then somebody has this response in the class and you're like, oh my God, what the heck's just happened there? Because all sorts of things can come up when you're working, especially when you do some of the strong spiritual-based pranayama practices. They can, really bring up stuff. Saying that, I remember that when I was in India, I was told not to bother going and doing any of those spiritual practices. I just had to balance my apana vayu. I just to make sure that I wasn't constipated, that I was eating my mangoes, and that I was just like getting really grounded before I did any of those, really intense breathing practices. So that's what I meant by, evoking memory and emotions. This is probably, I know that Ellen said something about yoga therapy. I do think there's a place for yoga therapy, but what I see is that yoga therapy at the moment can hide behind an allopathic model. I would like to see us skill up. That's just something I think we often say it's out of my remit, it's out of my scope. I don't think it is. I think we really need to address these things that are happening. I think we can. I think we can rethink and get creative. We can collaborate with other helping professions. I get lots of inquiries from midwives, doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists that want to use yoga, that see the usefulness of it. I'm interested in aligning yoga therapy as a somatic psychology, or certainly to use some kind of psychotherapeutic framework for yoga. Okay. And I think, let me just finish with, I just want to say a little bit about the work that I've done. This is from 24 years of experience, but in the past few years, I've been working more and more with people from different backgrounds, marginalized situations. And here's a group of women that were survivors of sexual violence, human trafficking, torture as well. And so some of the things that I was particularly using yoga to help normalize rest and relaxation. To get people to relax is not easy. Okay, it's not straightforward. Okay, we all get that stillness, but there can be a lot of resistance to that, and for a good reason. I'm very particularly interested in increasing trust in feeling and sensation. People can't always feel their bodies. They don't always trust themselves. To reduce their own internal suffering and harm, to restore the biorhythms, to reverse the isolation, to clear some of the violent beliefs and patterns that are inside of them. I think I'm kind of speeding up because I know I haven't got much time. I think I might just end there because I've got to got to make sure I don't say too much. Yeah. I'd like to bring in a bit more of an Ayurvedic connection with yoga. So that certainly supports me with understanding the body more. So in terms of grounding people so that they can then connect to that inner being that a lot of us have spoken about today. It's not so straightforward when you're working, again, with people from all sorts of different socioeconomic situations where their lives are so chaotic or so there's so much fear or oppression or strain that it's not so easy to just relax. It's a privilege to relax, actually. It's a real privilege to relax. And to go and do yoga and to go to some yoga studios, it's a privilege. It's a privilege to open up. It's not always easy for a lot of people. So I would be interested in seeing some more of this as kind of topics for conversation. That was...
Some of you might recognise Chris Jackson from last year's conference, where you were talking about, there's been a bit of a shift in focus.
Science and spirituality.
And now he's talking about yoga as a liminal experience, which I think fits in quite nicely with what you were both saying. So, Chris Jackson.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, interestingly, I was actually training to be a psychotherapist before I changed tracks because I felt that the yoga put me into a space where I was able to communicate what it was that I wanted to be able to convey. And the most difficult part about answering this question, what is yoga, is that so much of what it is purely experiential and completely pre-verbal. We run a teacher training school, and one of the first things that we try and get into people's heads is that actually the shift from experiencing and practicing and beginning to understand yoga in your body and then articulating it in a useful way are not necessarily even related concepts. So when the question came up and I started to tune into this idea, what is yoga? I found increasingly that what I was really answering was the question, just what is yoga to me? Which then began to beg the question, what actually am I to yoga? And potentially this is a question that many of us as teachers have asked. And the answer that I came up with was that what I hope to be, at least, is an access point to the state that Jim referenced. Something that for me has been transformative in ways that I couldn't begin to describe in the psychotherapeutic practice that once had been transformative for me. In a way that I felt was more long-lasting and also autonomous and empowering. So as an access point then, what I have is I have the map that I traversed to reach the territory that we're all working towards. A destination, a state perhaps that's the same, but as Nick, wherever Nick's at, I'm trying to make eye contact, there he is, rightly pointed out that there are many ways to that and that maybe beer yoga is as valid as any other purpose. Well, Nick also used the word satsang. The definition that my teacher uses for satsang is in the presence of truth. And to throw back to my talk last year, the underpinning point was that actually, if truth is something, then all paths towards it must ultimately be mutually accommodating. Right? So to answer then the question, what is yoga to me? What am I to yoga? What is it that facilitated that access to the state specifically about the journey that I went on was this concept of liminality. And liminality is derived from the Latin word limen, which means literally threshold or doorstep. And it's been developed anthropologically to mean the state of ambiguity and even disorientation that occurs at the point of maneuvering transitory periods. It can be very specific, it can be very formal, it can be biological in the sense that puberty is a liminal period. It can be environmental, dawn, dusk, these magical in-between spaces where the edges suddenly lose their definition and we're able to recalibrate in that space. Back to pedagogy, it's about religion, about rites of passage that are structured. The anthropologist Arnold van Gennep split the ritual passage of liminality into three distinct stages. The first of which is the pre-liminal stage. The point that you've reached a sense of perhaps not even dissatisfaction, but an eagerness to find something different. Your skin has somehow got too small and you're ready to shed it. The road that felt so clearly defined suddenly attracts hesitation. It doesn't feel like the right route anymore. And there is a necessary metaphysical death at this stage, which is so often the hardest part because it requires accepting that maybe what you were doing before wasn't necessarily right. Although I would argue that as a concept, right and wrong gets problematic anyway. Like Jim was saying, and like the text of yoga teachers, holding on to this idea of you as being a concrete thing is half the problem anyway. But it doesn't mean that it's easy to change, right? So a metaphysical death that doesn't necessarily occur consciously, but it will occur, maybe accidentally in your beer yoga class, right? While you're making mudras with lemurs. Which then moves into the second stage, which is the rite of passage itself. And this stage is defined by withdrawal from the normal rules of society that would otherwise structure your response. And perhaps where we experience it most powerfully is in retreat, is in isolation, is in the modern day equivalents of the hermitage caves that once existed and now don't so. Right? Hopefully, it's a space that we can begin to facilitate on people's mats, in people's classes. And this ultimately is a destructive stage. It's a stage of radically reevaluating the rigidity of the beliefs that made up what you thought you were, so that you can understand what the next step on this journey is. Jung describes the role of liminality in the same, he titled it the process of individuation. And he writes, what takes place in the dark phase of liminality is a process of breaking down. A process of breaking down ultimately in the interest of making whole again. One's meaning, one's purpose, one's sense of relatedness, and one's capacity to move forwards. There are several parameters for a liminal experience, as proposed by Van Gennep. And the first is that it must be led by an appropriate guide. An appropriate guide, which ties into our debates about what qualifies you to teach yoga, right? And how you define it in the first place, I think, defines what you're capable of teaching. And it also then puts a responsibility on the teacher to continue their own path forwards, which is going to require constant deconstruction as it moves forwards. Which then brings us to the third of the three stages of liminality, perhaps the most difficult one. Reintegrating those changes back in the relative circumstances that you needed to escape from in order to transition. Which is certainly the big part. How then, as an access point to this state that I'm hoping to share with people, how I facilitate that, it varies from room to room, from class to class, and from life to life. Right? But there are two downfalls on this cyclical but not endless path of liminality. And the first being that we never actually allow ourselves enough space to access this. We never get to that quiet enough place that we can allow this deconstruction to occur. Because the voices that are talking loudest are going to be inbuilt societally. Yeah. They're there in our inheritance, in our cultures, in our communities, and our colleagues. But the other way we go wrong is that we dwell too long in that place. We stay in that place of complete abstract deconstruction, never allow ourselves a period of reform that allows us to do something useful, right? With that knowledge, with that evolution, or with that devolution, right? With that returning to center. Right? And there becomes a necessity then to involve, if you like, this idea that you can turn in so much that becomes then an outward process, and that folding will continue and continue again. So my answer then to the question, what is yoga? Or at least, what has yoga been to me? Or perhaps most specifically, what can I usefully facilitate in the hope of sharing the state that I've attained with others? It's the capacity to create this in-between space that allows people to withdraw enough to re-enter fully, and space that allows people time away enough from themselves, their relationships, so that they can begin to understand, actually, what it is that's been driving the system all along. And I got that even before any dings went off.
Well done.
Thank you very much.
So I said that I would define yoga, and I meant in this context. Loving the joints is yoga posture practice. But more generally, yoga is very, very broad. Karma yoga, bhakti yoga, Raja yoga, Hatha yoga. In that broader context, to me, yoga is very simple. It's self-inquiry. Self-inquiry, not self-improvement. Self-inquiry, not self-analysis. Self-inquiry. This is not what you're doing when you're in a psychotherapist's office. This is self-analysis. Self-inquiry goes deeper, takes you deeper beyond your particularities into your nature, so that your particularities can be contextualized and softened within your nature, within the depths and subtleties of your nature. So if yoga is self-inquiry, then this has some implications. So if you think it isn't, that's fine. But if yoga is self-inquiry, then it does have some implications. One of them is you do it yourself. It's self-inquiry. Second, it's an inquiry on the self. But what does that mean? It doesn't mean your social self. Basically what it means is that you penetrate the roots of human experience. That you become intimate with how human experience is generated. And what that means is how human intelligence functions. This is not an academic thing. It's self-inquiry. You do it by becoming intimate with your own experience. Because you're experiencing all the time. You can do it anywhere. That's why there's so many forms of yoga. You don't need a yoga mat. Because you're always experiencing. So long as you've got space and time and you feel safe enough, you have potentially the possibility of examining your own experience, not its content. Do you understand? Not its content, but how is experience generated? What is the relationship between cognitive intelligence and spiritual intelligence, for example? They're functioning. They're both functioning. Somatic intelligence is working all the time. You have to distinguish between them. You have to understand their apparent relationships. I say apparent because they're not related. It's all the same thing. It's our minds that are distinguishing between them. So how do we, if we think we are temporarily, until we get over it, a yoga teacher, help people in this self-inquiry, whether it's somatically or not? Let's just focus on the somatic. Yoga posture practice. Well, first of all, you have to really make it very clear in your own mind that this is an inquiry. That this is not about becoming able to do something. It's an inquiry into human nature. It's an inquiry into the ground of human experience. You could say the dynamics of human experience. You could say the functioning of human intelligence. So you have to somehow make it clear that you're not demanding anything. That you're just inviting. But that they mustn't be demanding anything. Not of their body, not of their mind, not of their experience, not of their feelings. So there are certain words or phrases that make that possible. Such as much as possible, as comfortably as possible, as X as possible, only as much as possible. What's possible? And of course you can say, inquire into the possibility of whatever it is that you think is valuable, into the possibility of softening, into the possibility of lengthening towards. But you have to be very careful, in a sense. I don't know that you have to be very careful. You just have to have got very clear in your mind that it's not your business to know or decide what they should be experiencing or feeling. But you can invite them to feel softness. But you can't invite them to feel softness directly by saying, just feel softness. You invite them to feel softness by reminding them what needs to be done for softness to be a possibility. So then you are telling them to do things, but it's an invitation. So what did I say at the beginning of this class? You don't have to do anything that I say. You don't have to do anything that I say. And as a teacher, you have to know that. Your students will do whatever they want. And they should. You should let them know that's okay. But they've come here, supposedly, maybe you don't have much, but for your expertise. So they are going to listen, so long as you make sense. But it's really important that you're getting them to listen to their body, to the intelligence of their body, and that you're not just saying that you're actually, with every single word you're saying, you're teaching them how to do that. And that's all you need to teach them to do, how to hear their body. You don't need to teach them how to do handstands. Anybody who can listen to their body can teach themselves how to do a handstand safely. It's not difficult. What's difficult is learning to hear the intelligence of your body speaking clearly. It does speak clearly. But are you hearing? That's the problem. So it's a journey, and that's the teaching journey. You're not teaching people how to listen to their bodies. You're teaching people things that might allow them to learn. So it's not the things that you're teaching that's important. It's the learning that's going on inside of them relative to their own intelligence that's important. Because yoga is self-enquiry. And the third implication of self-enquiry is very simple. It happens by itself. It is the natural movement of intelligence to turn upon itself, to understand itself, to meet itself. So no struggle is required. No big effort is required. You're either interested or you're not right now. Maybe you were interested last week. Maybe you'll be interested next month. That's cool. And anybody who thinks otherwise is wrong.